privilege. And trust me when I say it is a privilege. I count it an absolute privilege to be sharing in this space, to be sharing with the community of God's people. And especially on a topic such as we have been deliberating on over these days, the Jamaican family.
Right.
And a perspective from the Word of God, but as well to look very hard at just what's happening in our nation and our role as church. What really is our role as church as we deal with, as we contend with some of the issues before us? If you recall, last week we made the point that the family is God's masterpiece. Ephesians 2:10 reminds us that you are God's masterpiece. And we said so that is particularly true for we who are the people of God and anything, whatever we represent, and more so for our families. We said that here in Jamaica, the Jamaican household was made up of just about 3 persons. We observed, though, the many, many challenges facing the Jamaican family. We said that 80% across the nation of the nation's children are born out of wedlock. That just about 25% of those who are of the age of marriage eventually get married. So we are not a marrying nation. In fact, just about 70% never get married. We pointed to the fact of the different family types that we have here in Jamaica and some of the challenges attending to the various family types. We identified, for instance, that group of the nation's children where we are told are called barrel children. And we said that 74% of households in some inner city communities have at least one child left behind by one or both parents to work things out on his or her own, the barrel child syndrome and its implications for national building and national development. We also pointed to the phenomenon of the jacket children, serious, painful, socio-cultural and socio-economic reality in this country, where depending on where you're reading, the rate of jacket children is alarming. Dr. Herbert Gale tells us that is about 25%. At the United States Embassy, where fathers are filing for their children, it's 1 in 10. And then we're being told that in 2019 at Polygenics Consulting, that the rate there is as high as 70%. 77 out of 10 of the children who go there find that they do not have the right father, either on their birth certificate or otherwise. We looked at just some of the issues that attend there and how we as church have to deal with, have to contend with, have to grapple with these issues, and whether or not as community we are taking the right tools to contend with these national issues that are close to us, issues that we have to relate to because of where some of our churches are located, issues that confront us when we look across our fence and we have to interact in different spaces, at the workplace, in our streets, and so on. How do we answer? So we want to continue the conversation there. I want to start here in the conversation this evening, as it's a difficult place to begin, because so much of what we see in our country, and as we said last time, just jump in, share, make your comment, ask your questions. Let's interact together. We can learn and grow together. All right. So we're told that more than a third of our nation's children have no father figure, and over 90% of households have the parenting role being performed by mother or grandmother. I don't know how you feel about this kind of statistic, but this is very, very frightening. If a country is to be headed in the right direction, this model will not do. And we realize that churches, that families, the family structure itself is out of whack, is out of balance. And the consequences are deleterious. And so we have to ask ourselves whether or not we as church will now not have to step up and take on, God's willing, next week we want to talk about the discipling role that we will now have to be taking on in some very, very serious ways. But even before we get there, just a clear understanding of the depth of the problem that we have here out at Marvelly, and I have no doubt that similarly you have out there at Galilee as well. Because what we are seeing is asking mothers and grandmothers to play a role that God did not equip them to play. Friends, with the greatest of love and respect to the ladies in the platform, let's remember this, that mothers were not designed to father children. And the trouble is, and the tragedy is, that because our sisters are being called upon to play a double role, even in that way, doing the best that they can, that very act itself creates some of the problems. And we want to talk about that a little bit later on, but just to recognize it for what it is. Despite the best efforts of our sisters, despite pushing as hard as they can, that itself becomes a part of the dysfunctionality of the Jamaican family setting. And I dare say across the Caribbean, because the fathers are absent physically, or if not absent physically, many of our fathers are absent emotionally. And even that compounds the problem. We'll break that out a little bit more as the conversation progresses. But we have to stop and ask ourselves, on our next slide, why is it that in the Jamaican setting, there are so many of our sisters who end up having to lead the family? Well, let's talk about what's happening with our single mothers. Not many studies are there, but what we know for sure is that we're living in a matriarchal frame. That is to say, many of our households are led by mothers, single mothers in particular. And in many, many instances, the point of reference for anything of meaning and significance and worth and value is coming from our mothers. Because even when men are present, they are just passing through. They are just there for a season. And many of us will know that in many of the Jamaican homes, we will not find all of the children with the same surname. In my case, for instance, there are 3 surnames in my family of origin, 3 surnames. And the impact of that and how that affects interrelatedness, interrelations, and so on. And the sense too of one child coming to a place probably of feeling himself to be half to everybody. So that child has no brother and sister to call his or her own specifically because he or she is only half brother or half sister to the other siblings in the family setting and in the room. And the trauma of that sense of detachment and brokenness that brings into the family setting. Now, there are some families who will never understand that dynamic, but for others, it's a tragedy that they're trying to contend with, trying to contain, trying to deal with. And in many ways, it breaks out and it spills out in all kinds of dysfunctionalities. Some of the dysfunctionalities that we see in our family life setting is on account of this very thing that is hurting us as a community, hurting us as a people, especially because we have walked away. In some cases, we have run away from God's model for family life and the structure that He has set out, not only as the ideal, but as the most effective way to preserve nationhood, to preserve community, and to make people feel safe in that space. What are some of the reasons that our sisters end up in this role? So let's go to the next slide. Divorce, not very high, but it's a reality. Breakup, man just move on. There's a story and you may have heard me talk about it. Jesus calls her as one of his witnesses to the resurrection story and to his messiahship. It's a woman at the well. And sometimes many of us have been disparaging of her. And who is this woman? Many people say that she was an immoral woman. I'm not sure what the reason is there for that claim. Many people have different opinions about her, but what we know is that she was married 5 times. That in and of itself is a statement of her own willingness to do things the right way. So she chose marriage 5 times. And whatever the reason, at the end, when Jesus met her, 5 men had left her. So we're talking about divorce. We're talking about abandonment. We're talking about breakup. We're talking about rape. We're talking about childbirth by a single person. We're talking about childbirth. We're talking about single person adoption. All these variables that cause some of our women to be in this kind of situation where they become a single mother. None of these are easy things to talk about. My fear, saints, is that as church, we have not talked sufficiently about a lot of the sisters in our meetings. We have not been open enough to talk with and to our divorced sisters. How did you end up divorced? Not in a interrogating kind of a way, but in a way for understanding so that we can build church to be a safe place for a divorced woman. The woman who comes to church as a consequence of a breakup and is living in church space as a broken woman because a man abused her, and she's a victim of intimate partner violence. That's again something that as church we don't talk much about. And worse, where the perpetrator is within the church itself. we don't want to say much about it. But here are some of the reasons before us. The person who is widowed. What do you say to a sister who is widowed? What conversation do we safely have with that person? The person who is abandoned, person gone to America, and you thought that they were going there to pick apple or to cut cane or some such thing, but they went there on the farm work program and end up creating a family there, and they're lost to the family back home, except that occasionally they may send some money home. What is the conversation we are having with these persons as church? And do people feel safe to open their hearts to have these conversations? When a girl's mom is not there, some of the things she struggles with, and we see this a lot in our own culture, a girl who loses her mother may suffer from anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, the lack of self-respect, spiraling emotions, irritability, no self-discipline, and no ability to cope with her emotions, and very often not sure how to deal with criticism from others. These are just some of the issues that some of our girls face where they have not grown with their moms, and their moms have not been a part of the conversation in their lives. And we have seen that in some instances in this country, and the pain and the trauma that has caused for many. It's people feel detached from parent. Similarly, on the next slide, please. Boys who do not have secure attachments with their mothers also go on to have behavioral problems. Boys who are close to their moms find that they do better at school. Boys who have healthy and safe relationships with their moms are more rounded. They know how to keep healthy and safe relationships because they have been there with their mom. Obviously, the opposite is going to be true, and that has been some of what we have seen in our own culture. I want to break out some of these ideas a little bit later on. Let's go over to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? The effects of fatherlessness on a boy. When father is there, the boy is more emotionally balanced, academically balanced, socially adjusted. When father is there, the boy has a better sense of sticking with his task, sticking with what is required of him. So twice as likely as those who do not enter college or find stable employment after high school, 75% less likely to have a teen birth, 80% likely to spend time in jail, and so on. So when father is present in this intentional way, the child functions in a more, if I want a better term, ordered way. We can look at those statistics there because they are important, and we're seeing a lot of that in how our own nation is unfolding, especially, and this is not a negative comment on our ladies at all, but when you look at what's happening economically, socioeconomically, our schools, our top schools, our universities, the tertiary institutions have a lot more of our sisters, maybe a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women in many instances. and in some even higher, again, depending on the profession. In fact, in some of the professions that were male dominated, we find that more and more sisters are occupying those roles and those places. Let's go to the next slide, please. Daniel has asked me to talk about the discipling component over next week. I'm not even sure how we're going to get there, because there's some critical elements that as church, we are not getting right if the family itself has already failed. And we as church are scratching where nobody's itching, then we are pretty much irrelevant. And I'm challenging us then to look at the generations. What is happening with the generations? The X generation, the Y generation, the Z generation. Are we understanding what's happening to them? Are we understanding what's happening to the latest generation, the Alpha generation? Are we realizing the power of the social influencers, and how many of the social influencers are Christians? Are we understanding the fact that information is no longer centered in the teacher? Are we understanding the shift away from the authority structure of church? And notice the conversation went over the standards and how some of us wanted to push standard over against relationship, because there's some persons we cannot talk to because we do not have permission to speak to them. We can't quote Bible verses, and I think Joseph learned that very, very early in his own life. There he was talking about, I will not sin against God. Mrs. Potiphar never had business with that. He was a slave in her house, and therefore his God was subject to her God. Whole heap of dynamics that I think we have to go back to the drawing table as church and try to have the conversation, because our women are hurting, because our men are not functioning properly. And our men are hurting because the dynamics have shifted from underneath them. And all of the, guess what? All of the bar mispering is happening in the gangs. All of the structured leadership principles are happening in the gangs. All of the things that should mark healthy society, where men are present, where men are engaged, all of those things, guess what? They are happening in the gangs. And they're not happening at church. And church, we're out of time, but we have to ask ourselves, it is not that these things are lost, but these things are happening away from and outside of us. And those very things that we hunger for and crave after are strong in the gangs, but they're not strong in society. Why? Why are they in the subculture, but not in general culture and in the place of, for want of a better word, orthodoxy? Why? Conversation. Let's try to wrap that up next week, God's willing. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for the input. Thank you for the interaction. And thank you for allowing me just to listen to the ladies talk just now. Thank you so much. God bless you, everybody.
Everyone just say the truth.